The date was March 15, 1944. The location was Pratt Army Airfield, a vast, flat expanse of concrete and prairie in the heart of Kansas, thousands of miles from the frontline battles raging across the world. Yet, on this unremarkable Midwestern airfield, a disaster of strategic magnitude was unfolding with terrifying regularity. On this particular afternoon, Captain Robert Morgan, a seasoned pilot training on America's most advanced weapon, watched helplessly as flames erupted from the number 3 engine of his B-29 Superfortress. The Wright R-3350 engine, a marvel of American industrial might promising 2,200 horsepower, was visibly cooking itself alive. The heat radiating from the cowling was immense, estimated to be well over 600 degrees Fahrenheit. A thick, billowing column of black smoke poured from the engine nacelle, a chilling sight that had become agonizingly familiar to the crews stationed at Pratt. In an instant, the airfield transformed into a scene of frantic, urgent action. Ground crews, already primed for this inevitable event, sprinted across the tarmac toward a burning aircraft, dragging heavy fire extinguishers behind them. This was, incredibly, the 4th engine fire to occur on this single airfield within the same week. It spoke to a systemic, lethal problem that threatened to derail the entire war effort. Morgan, reacting with the practiced calm of a man who had faced this exact scenario repeatedly, immediately killed the fuel mixture running to the burning engine. He then slammed his hand down on the fire suppression system trigger. The mechanism was designed to instantly flood the engine compartment with carbon dioxide, smothering the nascent blaze. But nothing happened, or rather, what happened was tragically insufficient. The extinguishing agent, the carbon dioxide, could not reach the actual source of the fire. The blaze was consuming the engine's rear cylinders, trapped and burning behind the intricate maze of baffles and cooling fins that comprise the engine's complex internal geometry. The extinguishing gas simply failed to penetrate the deep recesses where the heat was concentrated and the magnesium was igniting. Realizing the fire was utterly uncontrollable from the cockpit, Captain Morgan screamed the evacuation order to his crew. "Everybody out," he commanded, his voice tight with controlled urgency. The crew reacted with astonishing speed, a testament to the brutal, necessity-driven efficiency of their training. They evacuated the giant bomber in 45 seconds flat, the drills having become a grim form of muscle memory, honed by the constant threat of being incinerated on the ground. By the time the massive airfield fire trucks arrived, their sirens wailing a mournful, futile sound, the fate of the $600,000 bomber was sealed. The intense, uncontrolled heat of the engine fire had already melted to the main structural wing spar. The vital aluminum structure, once compromised, meant the entire aircraft was beyond saving. The Superfortress, a weapon built to deliver ultimate destruction, would not fly again. It would be scrapped for parts, another expensive, critical loss, thousands of miles away from any enemy action. This single incident encapsulated the nightmare facing the Army Air Forces. The B-29 was losing the war against itself, burning up American air crews and America's financial might on friendly soil. The spectacle of the B-29 Superfortress burning on the tarmac at Pratt Army Airfield, resulting in a $600,000 total loss, represented more than just a massive financial setback for the American war machine. It was a crippling blow to the nation's strategic ambition. This was a bomber designed to win the Pacific War, conceived to fly higher, faster, and farther than any other aircraft in existence, enabling it to bypass enemy defenses and strike directly at the heart of the Japanese industrial complex. The fact that this aircraft was scrapped before ever seeing combat was a chilling symbol of the program's profound internal crisis. It was happening everywhere, a relentless, non-stop wave of training accidents that were hemorrhaging resources and lives. At Smoky Hill Army Airfield, not far from Pratt, yet another B-29 was consumed by fire on the runway. At Walker Field in Kansas, 2 more caught fire during routine engine run-ups, checks that should have been mundane but were instead transforming into high-stakes emergencies. The most devastating loss occurred at Great Bend, where a Superfortress exploded during takeoff, A catastrophic failure that resulted in the immediate death of all 11 crew members before the aircraft had even achieved sufficient altitude to become airborne. These were not isolated incidents. They were systemic, pattern-driven slaughter. The financial cost alone was staggering. In 1944, $600,000 was an astronomical sum, representing not just the materials and labor for the complex aircraft, but countless hours of highly specialized engineering and manufacturing capacity diverted from other war production efforts. The loss was magnified by the critical time component. Every bomber loss was a setback to the strategic timeline for operations against Japan, a clock that General Henry Hap Arnold had promised President Roosevelt would hit zero by June 1944. Compounding the material and strategic loss was the devastating effect on morale. These air crews were the nation's elite handpicked for the B-29 program, yet they found themselves facing an enemy far more terrifying than the Japanese Zero. Their own engines. They were flying a death trap, a magnificent machine that was demonstrably more likely to kill them over a Kansas farm field than a Japanese fighter pilot was over the Pacific. The engineers, who represented the pinnacle of American aeronautical expertise, were working frantically, but their solutions were either too slow or completely ineffective. The problem was not a simple mechanical defect. It was a fundamental, inherent flaw in the engine's design, a lethal incompatibility between its promised power and the laws of thermodynamics. The loss of Captain Morgan's aircraft was just one data point in a catastrophic ledger, demonstrating the sheer impossibility of the situation. The B-29 program, America's greatest hope for a quick victory, was trapped in a destructive cycle, its aircraft burning on American runways, a continuous, devastating total loss that threatened the entire strategic future of the war. The scale of the B-29 problem transcended anecdote. It was defined by catastrophic statistics, figures that revealed a strategic crisis far deeper than any single accident report could convey. The official figures circulating within the highest levels of the Army Air Forces were terrifying and almost impossible to comprehend. Of the first 175 B-29s delivered to the service, a stunning 16 had burned completely. Total losses like the one Captain Morgan experienced. Furthermore, an additional 47 aircraft had suffered major engine fires, failures that resulted in critical damage, necessitating extensive, time-consuming repairs and the grounding of vital operational assets. When tallied, the core failure rate of the B-29's R-3350 engine was revealed to be a horrifying 35%. To have 1 out of every 3 engines suffer a major fire or catastrophic failure was not merely an acceptable operational challenge. It was an absolute program killer. For comparison, a failure rate of 5% will be considered serious. 35% was unprecedented for a frontline military aircraft in its intended operational phase. This statistical reality meant that the B-29, officially America's most expensive weapons program, costing more than the Manhattan Project that was secretly racing to develop the atomic bomb, was statistically a disaster. The massive investment in engineering, manufacturing, and personnel was being negated by the inherent unreliability of the propulsion system. General Henry Hap Arnold, the commanding general of the Army Air Forces, was trapped in a strategic nightmare. He had staked his reputation and the nation's wartime strategy on the B-29, promising President Franklin D. Roosevelt that the Superfortresses would be actively bombing targets in Japan by June 1944. The statistics, however, painted a grim picture. At the current, accelerating rate of loss, the program would inevitably kill more American air crews in training accidents within the continental United States than the Japanese enemy would be able to shoot down in combat. The enemy was effectively the aircraft itself. This statistical reality was the ultimate proof that the problem was not pilot error, poor maintenance, or bad luck. It was a fundamental design flaw that rendered the entire, incredibly expensive system operationally fragile and lethally dangerous. The 27th chapter of the war was being written in statistical reports, and the data showed that without a rapid, radical fix to the 35% engine failure rate, the B-29 program, and a strategic path to ending the war in the Pacific, was doomed to burn out before it even reached the fight. The terrifying numbers screamed for a solution, but everywhere the nation's top minds looked, they only found confirmation that the problem was fundamentally intractable. For General Henry Hap Arnold, commanding general of the Army Air Forces, the relentless series of B-29 engine fires constituted nothing less than a command nightmare. Arnold was not merely an administrator. He was the chief architect of America's air power strategy, and the B-29 was his masterwork, the key to fulfilling the promise of strategic, overwhelming air dominance against Japan. The failure of the R-3350 engine directly undermined his entire strategic vision and placed his personal credibility with President Roosevelt on the line. Arnold had guaranteed the president that the Superfortress, capable of operating from distant forward bases, would be hitting Japanese targets by June 1944. This was a commitment based on a firm belief in American engineering superiority and the rapid problem-solving capability of its defense industry. Now, with the June deadline looming, he found himself presiding over a program where 1 out of every 3 engines was statistically certain to suffer a major failure. The pressure on Arnold was immense, a race against the clock with geopolitical consequences. Every day lost meant more time for Japan to fortify its home island defenses and less time for the Allied forces to conclude the war. The catastrophic statistics circulating on his desk, Chapter 3, confirmed that the program was on a suicidal trajectory. The irony was devastating. The B-29 was built to save lives by shortening the war, yet was currently killing its own highly trained crews faster than the enemy could. Arnold's direct appeals and directives to Wright Aeronautical Corporation, the engine's manufacturer, and Boeing, the airframe designer, were met with technical explanations and slow, marginal improvements that failed to address the core problem. He needed a radical, rapid solution, a fix that could be implemented across the massive production line in weeks, not the months or years that the engineers were proposing for a complete engine redesign. Arnold understood the fundamental strategic flaw. The complexity of the B-29 design was proving to be a crippling liability. The best minds in the nation were debating fluid dynamics, thermodynamics, and structural mechanics, yet the aircraft continued to burn. His command was paralyzed by a problem that seemed to defy the very laws of physics and engineering. Arnold's nightmare was a realization that he had promised victory through technology, and that same technology was now threatening to consume his forces from within. He was desperately searching for an answer, yet the expert consensus continually returned the same hopeless verdict. The engine was flawed beyond rapid repair. The looming deadline of June 1944 was not just a date on a calendar. It was a point of no return for the American strategic bombing campaign, and General Arnold knew that the failure to meet would carry an unbearably high cost in blood and treasure. The ongoing crisis surrounding the B-29 revealed a hidden cost of war that was both morally and strategically indefensible. The certainty that the program would cause more losses in training than the Japanese would shoot down in combat. This was the ultimate betrayal of the air crews and the central paradox of the B-29's design. The Superfortress was conceived to be virtually untouchable in combat, flying at altitudes and speeds that enemy fighters struggled to reach. Yet, it was proving lethally vulnerable to its own mechanical components. As documented by the catastrophic 35% engine failure rate, Chapter 3, the constant stream of accidents on American airfields was systematically decimating the bomber fleet and, more tragically, destroying the lives of the highly trained airmen intended to crew the aircraft in the Pacific. The psychological toll on the crews was profound. They were asked to face the enemy, a known danger, but they were simultaneously forced to confront a deadly, internal threat that could manifest at any moment during a routine engine run-up or a simple training takeoff. The constant, unpredictable fires fostered a deep, corrosive sense of dread and distrust in the very machine they were supposed to rely on for survival. This pattern of loss was strategically disastrous for General Arnold. The Army Air Forces were not just losing aircraft, they were losing irreplaceable human capital, pilots, navigators, and engineers who had undergone years of specialized training. Every crew loss in Kansas was a direct reduction in the combat capacity available for planned operations against Japan. The sheer number of non-combat losses created an enormous logistical and industrial strain. Resources that should have been dedicated to building new bombers were instead being diverted to salvage, repair, and replace the aircraft destroyed on home soil. The entire production pipeline, from raw materials to final assembly, was being clogged by the constant stream of accidents. This hidden cost of war demonstrated that technology, when flawed, could become the deadliest enemy. The most powerful engine ever designed was turning against its creators, proving that complex engineering failures could be far more devastating than enemy opposition. The continued failure rate showed that without an immediate, fundamental solution, the B-29 program was doomed to cannibalize itself, ensuring that its final, tragic legacy would be marked by the appalling statistic of more American lives lost to its own engines than to the guns of the Imperial Japanese Army Air Force. The imperative to find a solution was no longer merely strategic. It was a moral obligation to the men who faced this terrifying, internal enemy every time they stepped into the cockpit. As the nation's elite aeronautical minds struggled in vain with the B-29 crisis, trapped by the established boundaries of fluid dynamics and engineering orthodoxy, the answer was quietly preparing to emerge in the most unexpected quarter. What nobody in the high-stakes conference rooms of Wright Aeronautical or Boeing could have possibly predicted as Captain Morgan watched his bomber burn, Chapter 1, was that the salvation of the entire B-29 program would not come from their esteemed ranks. It would not originate with the top design teams, nor would it be discovered by the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, the nation's foremost experts whose consensus was that the problem was fundamentally unsolvable without a complete engine redesign. Instead, the solution would come from an unlikely savior, a 38-year-old aircraft mechanic with a starkly humble background. His name was Tony Valadaur. Tony possessed only a 7th grade education, having dropped out of school early to support his family. Before the war intervened, he had spent the previous 15 years not studying aerodynamics or thermodynamics, but installing residential plumbing in the working-class neighborhoods of Cleveland, Ohio. Tony Valadaur was nobody's idea of an engineering genius. Yet it was his unique, unconventional expertise. His 15 years spent wrestling with copper pipes, frozen knuckles, and the frustrating logic of fluid flow in cramped, impossible spaces that would ultimately provide the intellectual key to unlock the crisis. His entire professional life had been devoted to one fundamental problem: how make a fluid flow where it naturally resists going. This practical, common-sense knowledge of fluid dynamics, derived from the trenches of basement plumbing, was a perspective entirely foreign to the highly academic, theory-bound world of aeronautical engineering. Tony saw the B-29's engine not as a complex, highly stressed array of cylinders and cooling fins, but as a giant malfunctioning heating system with a stubborn circulation problem. His seemingly ridiculous idea about pipes, a solution so disarmingly simple, so obvious from plumber's perspective, was precisely what the experts, blinded by complexity and established doctrine, could not conceive. The clock was ticking. Japan was fortifying its defenses. American bombers were burning. And Tony Valadaur, the plumber, was about to suggest a fix that would be so simple, so elegant, that the elite engineers would initially do nothing but laugh him out of the room, never realizing that their salvation lay in his hands and his unconventional wisdom. The central actor in this crisis was a Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone, an engine that was simultaneously magnificent on paper and a death trap in reality. Conceived at the height of American ambition, this engine was designed to be the most powerful air-cooled radial engine ever built, a technical marvel that promised to redefine air power. Its specifications were stunning: 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows, capable of churning out a phenomenal 2,200 horsepower. This immense power was engineered to push the massive B-29 Superfortress to speeds of up to 350 miles per hour and altitude of 30,000 feet, placing it safely above the reach of most enemy anti-aircraft fire and interceptors. Its theoretical performance was the very foundation of the Army Air Force's strategic vision for the Pacific Campaign. The engineering feat was immense, packing such tremendous thermal and mechanical energy into a relatively small, lightweight package. Yet, the drive for compactness and power pushed the engine to, and then tragically beyond, the absolute limit of its physical capability. The design was a study in internal conflict, a masterpiece of engineering that failed to reconcile its own thermal consequences. In reality, however, the duplex cyclone was a relentless killer. The problem lay in the engine's very geometry. It featured 9 cylinders in the front row and 9 in the rear. While the front cylinders received ample cooling air forced over them by the ram air rushing through the engine cowling at speeds exceeding 200 miles per hour, the rear cylinders were fatally compromised. They sat directly in the thermal shadow of the front row, starved for the essential airflow needed to dissipate the heat generated by the continuous, powerful explosions of combustion. This fatal lack of cooling meant that under normal operation, temperatures in the rear cylinders climbed uncontrollably, often reaching a blistering 550 degrees Fahrenheit. During high-power phases, such as the critical moments of takeoff and climb, temperatures would spike even higher, often exceeding 650 degrees. This was the thermal reality that turned the magnificent engine into a death trap. The aluminum cylinder heads began to warp at a mere 500 degrees. The exhaust valves, critical for controlling the engine's power cycle, failed at 575 degrees. The inevitable, catastrophic failure would occur at 600 degrees, the point at which the entire cylinder would seize, bringing the piston to a grinding, instant halt while the crankshaft continued to rotate violently at 2,800 revolutions per minute. The consequences were a brutal chain reaction. Connecting rods snapped, pistons were driven through cylinder walls, and superheated oil sprayed onto the exposed, fiery hot metal, igniting the magnesium alloy engine cases. The duplex Cyclone R-3350 was a monument to ambition, yet was ultimately a spectacular, self-destructive machine. The root cause of the B-29 crisis was not a simple mechanical defect, but a fundamental conflict with the laws of thermodynamics, specifically concerning the isolation and management of rear cylinder heat. The massive power output of the R-3350 engine generated an equally massive amount of thermal energy. The engine's 18 cylinders were essentially continuous, controlled explosions, and the challenge was dissipating the heat fast enough to maintain structural integrity. The design failed catastrophically in this respect due to a critical oversight in airflow management. The front cylinders were naturally bathed in a forceful torrent of cooling air, known as ram air, which entered the cowling and passed directly over their cooling fins. This was effective, but the air immediately became superheated, sometimes reaching 300 degrees Fahrenheit. In the process, the intended design then required the superheated air to flow rearward between the 2 cylinder rows to cool the rear cylinders. However, the laws of thermodynamics dictate that heat will always attempt to find an equilibrium, and fluid, in this case, air, will take the path of least resistance. The engineers failed to account for the physical constraints that governed this flow. The rear cylinders were seated directly in the thermal shadow of the front cylinders. The already heated air attempting to flow rearward encountered a complex maze of obstructions, structural components, plumbing, and the geometry of the cylinder heads themselves. Instead of creating a clean, high-velocity cooling path, the design created a region of stagnation. The hot air became trapped between the cylinder rows. Rather than cooling the rear cylinders, this trapped, stagnant air became a thermal blanket, actively heating the metal to critical temperatures. This led directly to the core problem. Sustained temperatures in the rear cylinders routinely climbed to 550 degrees Fahrenheit during normal operation. During high power climbs, temperatures easily exceeded 600 degrees. This extreme, localized rear cylinder heat was the Achilles heel of the magnificent engine. The aluminum cylinder heads were designed to withstand a certain thermal load, but at these sustained temperatures, their structural integrity was rapidly compromised. The engineers were fighting against the simple reality that the rear cylinders were not receiving sufficient mass flow of unheated air, and the design did not provide an adequate escape route for the heated air. It was a failure of energy transfer, a direct violation of the non-negotiable laws of thermodynamics that ensured the B-29 would continuously burn itself up. The ultimate result of the uncontrolled rear cylinder heat was a disastrous and highly consistent failure mechanism that rendered the B-29 the deadliest aircraft in the world to its own crews. The process was a brutal, destructive chain reaction initiated by the sustained high temperatures. The critical thermal threshold was reached when the temperatures in the rear cylinders consistently exceeded 500 degrees Fahrenheit. At this point, the aluminum cylinder heads, which require precise tolerances to function properly, would begin to warp. This warping directly compromised the seal and the internal geometry of the combustion chamber, leading to immediate performance degradation. The situation worsened dramatically when temperatures climbed past 575 degrees, at which point the crucial exhaust valves, responsible for releasing the spent gases from the cylinder, would begin to fail structurally, leading to a loss of compression and control over the engine cycle. The point of no return was 600 degrees, the temperature at which the entire cylinder could seize. Cylinder seizure is an immediate, catastrophic event. It means the piston, which is rigidly connected to the massive rotating crankshaft, instantly stops moving inside the cylinder wall due to the total failure of lubrication and thermal expansion of the metal. The piston is now stationary, locked solid inside the cylinder, while the crankshaft continues rotating violently at 2,800 revolutions per minute. The immense mechanical energy of the rotating mass is instantly transferred to the rigid connections. This stress immediately causes the connecting rods to snap. The broken rods and the seized piston then become shrapnel, punching through the cylinder walls, tearing the engine apart from the inside. This is the moment when the fire becomes inevitable and uncontrollable. The engine's internal components, now catastrophically exposed and damaged, are simultaneously venting high-pressure oil that has been heated far beyond its flashpoint, which sprays directly onto the superheated metal of the broken cylinders and the engine case. The surrounding magnesium alloy of the engine case, already weakened by the extreme heat, ignites upon contact with the spraying oil and high-temperature metal. This is a failure mechanism that transformed a simple engineering challenge into a fatal, unstoppable blaze. It was a self-destruct sequence, triggered by the uncontrollable warping aluminum and the resulting seizing pistons, a chain of events that left the crews with less than 90 seconds to escape the burning wreckage. The terminal stage of the R-3350's failure mechanism was characterized by the unstoppable blaze, an inferno fueled by the presence of magnesium alloys in the engine casing. Once the internal engine components shattered, spraying hot oil onto the superheated metal, the magnesium alloy engine cases, chosen for their lightweight, provided the perfect, devastating fuel. Magnesium is notoriously difficult to extinguish once ignited, burning with a ferocious intensity at temperatures that can exceed 5,600 degrees Fahrenheit. This metal fire was the reason the B-29 engine fires were so devastating and why the conventional fire suppression systems, which merely flooded the compartment with carbon dioxide, were completely useless. The fire was not simply burning fuel or oil, it was consuming the very structure of the engine itself, burning at a temperature hot enough to rapidly melt and compromise surrounding structures. The most terrifying consequence of this unstoppable blaze was its effect on the aircraft's primary structure, the main aluminum wing spar. The wing spar is the single most critical load-bearing structure of the wing, designed to support the enormous weight and aerodynamic stresses of the Superfortress in flight. The intense heat of the burning magnesium engine, directed immediately against the aluminum airframe, was capable of melting through the aluminum wing spar in 90 seconds. This gave the crew less than 2 minutes from the moment of catastrophic engine failure to safely evacuate before the structural integrity of the wing was completely compromised, leading to the potential loss of control and total breakup of the aircraft. The fire was trapped inside the engine cowling, behind baffles and structural components, meaning the carbon dioxide from the onboard fire extinguisher bottles could not penetrate to the source of the blaze. The design flaw was a cruel paradox. The components intended to protect the aircraft were in fact trapping the magnesium fire, concentrating the 5,000-degree heat against a vulnerable wing structure. This final, terrifying stage of the failure mechanism, the magnesium alloys turning the engine into an incinerator and the subsequent melting of the wing spars, was a grim reality that transformed a high-tech wonder into a total loss. It was a physical manifestation of the B-29 systemic problem, a devastating fire that the engineers had simply failed to account for. Faced with the mounting pressure from General Hap Arnold and the grim reality of the catastrophic statistics, the entire American aviation industry mobilized, desperately searching for a rapid solution to the B-29's lethal thermal problem. Boeing's engineers, responsible for integrating the R-3350 engine into the Superfortress airframe, were among the first to launch a series of intense, round-the-clock efforts, resulting in a succession of futile fixes. Their initial focus was entirely rational, centered on addressing the root cause: inadequate airflow to the rear cylinders. If the rear cylinders were starved for cooling air, the simplest solution, according to standard aeronautical engineering principles, was to provide them with more. Boeing engineers tried several major design changes, all aimed at increasing the volume and velocity of the cooling air. The first attempt involved significantly increasing the size of the cooling air intake at the very front of the engine cowling. The theory was straightforward. More air volume entering the engine should logically translate to more air reaching the rear cylinder bank. Prototype cowlings were swiftly manufactured and tested, but the results were immediately disappointing. While the overall volume of air ingested by the engine assembly did increase, the core issue remained unchanged. The air, upon passing over the front cylinder bank, became superheated and, due to the complex internal geometry, still failed to penetrate and dissipate the heat effectively around the rear cylinders. The air continued to stagnate in the critical intercylinder space, confirming that this was a flow path problem, not an air volume problem. The air still took the path of least resistance, bypassing constricted, high-pressure zone where it was needed most. Recognizing this failure, the engineers moved on to installing larger oil coolers. The idea here was to use the engine's lubrication system as a secondary thermal management tool, extracting more heat from the oil before it circulated back through the engine's internal components. While this provided a marginal improvement, perhaps lowering the peak cylinder temperatures by a crucial but insufficient 5 to 10 degrees, it was nowhere near enough to prevent the aluminum from warping or the cylinder from seizing during prolonged high-power operation, such as a critical phase of takeoff. The core temperature issue, the 600-degree threshold that caused structural failure, remained terrifyingly within reach. Boeing's best efforts, driven by immense pressure and vast resources, repeatedly hit the same thermal wall. These were not mistakes of carelessness, but failures born of complexity, proving that the solution required more than simply augmenting the existing design. It required a radical, completely different way of thinking about how fluids, in this case air, travel to the engine's lethal internal maze. Following the failure of the initial airflow and oil cooling modifications, Boeing engineers turned their attention to the cowl flaps, the adjustable panels at the rear of the engine cowling that are critical for controlling cooling airflow and managing aerodynamic drag. This decision immediately plunged the design team into a profound cowl flap dilemma, a devastating trade-off between the engine's desperate need for cooling and the aircraft's critical requirement for speed and performance. The cowl flaps work by opening slightly, creating a low-pressure area behind the engine. This low pressure helps to draw the cooling air through the cylinder banks, effectively sucking the hot air out and encouraging fresh air to enter the intake. The previous B-29 design required the flaps to be open significantly during takeoff and climb, the phases where the engine was generating maximum lethal heat. Boeing's engineers redesigned the cowl flaps, attempting to optimize their shape and size to improve the draw-through of air, hoping to finally alleviate the rear cylinder heat issue. The new design was marginally more effective at cooling the engine when fully open, but introduced a catastrophic new problem related to aerodynamic drag. When the newly designed cowl flaps were opened to the necessary degree, required to prevent the rear cylinders from spiking past 600 degrees. The resultant aerodynamic drag was immense. This drag penalty was so severe that pilots reported they could not fully open the flaps during takeoff without losing critical airspeed. Takeoff is the single most power-intensive and dangerous phase of flight. A loss of critical airspeed during this maneuver, particularly on a fully loaded bomber, is an immediate, potentially fatal risk. Pilots were forced to choose between two unacceptable forms of potential death: open the flaps fully and risk a catastrophic stall, or crash due to insufficient lift, or keep the flaps partially closed to maintain speed and risk the certain engine fire and explosion of the R-3350 due to overheating. The cowl flap dilemma became a brutal zero-sum game. The solution required to save the engine was directly undermining the airframe's ability to fly safely. This proved that the problem was not external airflow, but the internal resistance within the engine itself. No matter how much they manipulated the external pressures using cowl flaps, the cooling air simply could not overcome the inherent thermal and structural obstacles inside the cylinder rows. The engineers were forced to conclude that they could not cool the engine by external means without destroying the B-29's performance envelope, leaving the crisis exactly where it started: an unsolvable design conflict. Following the frustrating failures of Boeing's attempts to modify external airflow, the crisis shifted back to Wright Aeronautical Corporation, the engine's manufacturer. They dispatched a team of their best, most experienced engineers to the airfields to conduct an exhaustive, on-site investigation into the R-3350's internal geometry. The Wright team conducted meticulous tear-downs and thermal mapping, confirming all the previous data regarding the lethal concentration of rear cylinder heat. Their investigation led them to a critical structural finding: the baffle clearance problem. The engineers focus on cylinder baffles, which are thin sheets of aluminum placed between the cylinder cooling fins. These baffles are essential. Their job is to act like small directional guide vanes, forcing the cooling air to flow tightly over the cylinder heads and fins to maximize heat transfer. The findings were stark. The baffles in the R-3350 had insufficient clearance. There was barely half an inch of space between the edges of the baffles and the peaks of the cylinder cooling fins. This narrow, constricted gap was identified as the primary choke point for the cooling air. According to Wright's analysis, air cannot flow efficiently, that is, at the high mass flow rate and velocity required for effective cooling, through such a narrow, high-resistance path. The existing design was essentially creating a thermal bottleneck. The air was backing up, stagnating, and heating the entire rear cylinder assembly rather than cooling it. The solution, based on their conventional engineering expertise, seemed obvious. The clearance had to be increased. The baffles needed to be redesigned, manufactured with a wider profile, creating more room for the cooling air to flow between the fins and the baffles themselves. This would reduce the airflow resistance, theoretically allowing the cooling air to move effectively toward the rear cylinders. However, the obvious solution immediately revealed a disastrous structural consequence: the entire engine cowling. The complex ring of metal and supporting structure surrounding the engine had been designed and tooled specifically around the existing insufficient baffle configuration. Changing the baffle design, even by a seemingly trivial half-inch, would necessitate changing the cowling. Changing the cowling, due to the tight integration of the engine nacelle, would require changing the wing structure at the engine mounting points. And changing the wing structure meant redesigning the entire aircraft at its most fundamental level. This final, definitive conclusion from Wright Aeronautical officially confirmed the crisis. The problem was inherent and structural, leading directly to the estimated timeline and cost that General Arnold could simply not afford. Wright Aeronautical's conclusion regarding the deep, structural nature of the baffle clearance problem led directly to the official production deadlock. The engineers had identified the precise cause of the thermal failure, but the cost and time required to fix it were utterly prohibitive, slamming the door shut on any conventional, high-level solution. Implementing the required changes, redesigning the baffles, Retooling the cowling and modifying the wing structure to accommodate the new nacelle dimensions would necessitate a complete stop or major slowdown on the production lines of Boeing, which were already running at capacity. Boeing's detailed assessment delivered the paralyzing estimate. It would take a minimum of 18 months to fully implement such fundamental structural changes across the existing production line, from the point of drawing board finalization to the delivery of the first newly designed aircraft. Furthermore, the cost, including retooling, engineering labor, and scrap inventory, was estimated to be in excess of $50 million. This production deadlock presented General Hap Arnold with an impossible choice. He was in a race against the clock, having promised the president that B-29s would be bombing Japan by June 1944. The Japanese enemy was building up defenses, and the strategic window for a decisive air campaign was closing rapidly. Arnold simply did not have 18 months. He didn't even have 18 weeks. The first B-29 combat missions were scheduled to commence in less than 12 weeks. Accepting the engineering consensus meant signing the death warrant for the entire strategic bombing campaign. It meant postponing the B-29's operational deployment until late 1945 or even 1946, a delay that could prolong the entire Pacific War, costing hundreds of thousands of lives in ground assaults. Arnold could not afford the time, and the nation could barely afford the additional $50 million, especially when the current fleet was being destroyed at an alarming rate. The deadlock was a profound testament to the fatal arrogance of the original design. The complex, highly integrated nature of the engine, cowling, and wing structure made any necessary structural modification instantly cascade into a program-killing endeavor. The consensus from the top of the American aviation industry was clear. The thermal problem was not technically difficult to understand, but it was structurally impossible to solve under the current wartime constraints. The only available path, the correct path according to engineering orthodoxy, was simply too long, too slow, and too costly for a nation fighting a two-front war. The severity of the production deadlock and the grim casualty rate converged on a single, terrifying deadline. Time is ticking, with only 12 weeks remaining until first B-29 combat missions were scheduled for June 5, 1944. This 12-week countdown was the ultimate source of pressure on the entire chain of command, from mechanics on the airfield to General Hap Arnold himself. The commitment to this date was absolute, woven into the strategic planning of the Pacific War. The B-29 was not merely a new plane. It was a cornerstone of the entire Allied strategy. The idea that this cornerstone would be absent, or worse, be a liability, was unthinkable. The operational reality, however, was paralyzing. In these final weeks, B-29s were being lost faster than they could be replaced. The crews, fully aware of the statistics, were flying in terror. Every takeoff was a gamble against a 35% chance of major engine failure. The continued accidents meant that even if a design fix were miraculously found, there would be insufficient time to train the necessary crews and establish the logistical support needed for the massive bombing campaign scheduled for June. The clock was also ticking against the Japanese timeline. Allied intelligence confirmed that Japan was utilizing every available day to strengthen its air defenses and disperse its critical industrial targets. The element of surprise and overwhelming force that the B-29 was meant to provide would be diluted with every passing week. The 12 weeks represented the crucial window in which the entire structural integrity of the B-29 program had to be regained. The engineering consensus demanded 18 months for a proper fix. The reality of the war demanded a fix in under 3 months. This stark, terrifying conflict between engineering necessity and strategic necessity created a vacuum of leadership and solution. Every proposal that came from the conventional channels, Wright, Boeing, NACA, either demanded too much time or offered only marginal, temporary relief. The situation was desperate, characterized by a pervasive sense of failure and frustration among the technical elite. As the calendar flipped closer to June, the problem was becoming a public relations disaster and a major strategic vulnerability. The only hope was for a radical, unconventional solution, something that completely bypassed the need for major structural retooling, something that could be designed, tested, and implemented in days, not months. But no one in the official channels could conceive of such a radical break from orthodoxy. In the desperate final weeks leading up to the scheduled combat deployment, the crisis reached its intellectual nadir. The ultimate judgment came from the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, NACA, the predecessor to NASA and the nation's highest authority on aeronautical science. NACA was brought in as the impartial, elite problem solver, representing the absolute expert consensus. In June 1944, a B-29 was delivered to NACA's massive aircraft engine research laboratory in Cleveland, Ohio. Their engineers ran the R-3350 engines inside their colossal altitude wind tunnel, simulating the exact, punishing conditions of flight at 30,000 feet, where the cooling problem was at its worst. The exhaustive testing confirmed every grim detail that the field engineers already knew. The rear cylinders were receiving inadequate airflow. The NACA experts validated the findings of both Boeing and Wright Aeronautical. The engine generated too much heat for its compact package, and internal geometry fatally choked the cooling air. However, the NACA conclusion went further and was far more damning. After weeks of intense analysis, running complex thermodynamic models and flow simulations, the expert panel delivered their ultimate verdict. The B-29's engine problem was fundamentally unsolvable without a complete engine redesign. This was a death blow to General Arnold's hope for a rapid fix. The most respected technical minds in America stated that the laws of thermodynamics were simply against the R-3350's current configuration. The engine, they declared, was structurally flawed in its very essence. It was too powerful and too constrained. The amount of heat generated could not be safely dissipated by the size and geometry of the existing cooling system. For the top engineers, the only correct long-term solution was to go back to the drawing board, fundamentally change the size or configuration of the engine, a process that would require years, not months. The expert consensus was unanimous. The B-29 program, as currently configured, could not achieve operational reliability. This intellectual surrender created a void. With the official experts declaring the problem intractable, the door was inadvertently left open for a completely non-conventional thinker, someone operating entirely outside the boundaries of NACA's and Wright's established aerodynamic and thermal principles. The solution would have to be simple, cheap, and so obvious it had been overlooked by every person educated enough to understand the complexity of the problem. By September 1944, the situation was no longer a crisis. It was a desperate hemorrhage of lives and material. The chilling reality had become undeniable. The descent of the B-29 program was accelerating, defined by the horrifying statistic that 2/3 of the lost aircraft were succumbing to their own engines. Of the 414 B-29s that would ultimately be lost during the entire span of World War II, only 147 will be shot down by enemy action. The remaining 267, a staggering 64%, will be lost engine fires and related mechanical failures. This was a definitive statistical proof of the hidden cost of war, confirming the nightmare General Arnold faced. The B-29 program was losing bombers to its own engines faster than Boeing could possibly build them. The 20th Air Force was engaged in a war of attrition against its own technology. The psychological impact of this descent on the air crews was catastrophic. They were no longer simply worried. They were terrified. Pilots coined a grim nickname, the Flying Funeral Pyre, a bitter, desperate acknowledgement of the lethal danger lurking under the engine cowlings. The fear was so intense and so validated by the constant accidents that experienced air crew began openly requesting transfers to B-17s and B-24s. Older, slower, less capable, but crucially, more reliable aircraft. The men preferred to fly a plane that had a better chance of being shot down over enemy territory than one that was guaranteed to randomly incinerate them over friendly Kansas. At Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio, at the NACA lab in Cleveland, and at Boeing's immense plants. The answer remained a unified, hopeless echo. There is no solution. The engineers were stuck in a loop of complexity, unable to conceive of a fix that didn't violate the production deadlock. The B-29 was spiraling downward, a testament to the fact that over-engineering, when fundamentally flawed, can be more lethal than enemy opposition. The entire strategic campaign hinged on a technological fix that the nation's top aviation minds had officially declared to be non-existent, leaving the desperate Air Force facing an impossible choice: continue the deadly training flights or abandon the centerpiece of the Pacific War strategy entirely. While the nation's top aeronautical engineers were locked in conference rooms debating computational fluid dynamics and thermal failure thresholds, the unexpected answer was about to be found by a man who was utterly devoid of an advanced engineering degree. Antonio Toni Valiter was a quintessential outsider. Born in 1906 in Cleveland's Little Italy, he had a starkly different resume. He had spent his formative years not in an academic institution, but deep within the frozen, cramped basements of Cleveland, running copper pipes and fixing clogged drains. His life's work was practical, installing residential plumbing. When the war began, he was 35, too old for front lines, but his application to Curtiss-Wright landed him a job as an aircraft mechanic at Pratt Army Airfield. Toni was nobody's idea of an aircraft engineer. Everything he knew about the R-3350 came from a hurried, 3-week training course. His real education, his true expertise, was flow. Toni knew that water, like air, doesn't care about a blueprint. It takes the path of least resistance. If a radiator on the 3rd floor of an old apartment building wasn't getting hot, the problem wasn't the boiler, it was the path. The hot water was taking an easier, lower pressure path to the 2nd floor, bypassing the 3rd. Toni's secret was the ability to troubleshoot flow, to figure out why pressure dropped mysteriously or why a heating system developed cold spots. He didn't force the water, he guided it, creating a path where flowing was easier than not flowing. It was this unique plumber's perspective that he brought to the maintenance hangar at Pratt. He wasn't seeing 9 front cylinders and 9 rear cylinders. He was seeing a complex, malfunctioning water system with severe circulation problem. It was September 1944, and Toni was working the night shift, inspecting an engine that had barely avoided a fire. He removed the cowling and stared at the rear cylinders, blackened and stress-fractured from chronic overheating. As he traced the intended path of the cooling air, entering at the front, flowing over the front row, and then supposedly flowing to the rear, he saw what the engineers, constrained by their academic models of force flow, had missed. The air wasn't flowing to the rear cylinders. It was stagnating. The front row was heating the incoming air, and that hot air was entrapped, acting like an insulating blanket, actively heating the rear cylinders instead of cooling them. Toni's mind immediately went back to that apartment building on Euclid Avenue. The solution for the radiators was simple: a bypass pipe. Standing in the maintenance hangar, staring at the R-3350, a $4 million war machine, Toni conceived a ridiculously simple plumber solution. Why force the air through the engine when you could route around? Toni Valiter's entire professional life had prepared him for this moment, equipping him with the secret flow, a practical truth that superseded all the theoretical complexities drowning the B-29 engineers. Toni's philosophy, forged in the trenches of residential plumbing, was simple. Water doesn't care about blueprints. Fluids, whether they be water in a pipe or air over a cylinder head, adhere to only one rule: the path of least resistance. The high-level aeronautical engineers were obsessed with forcing massive volumes of air through a complex, high-resistance internal maze. They designed the R-3350 engine with a theoretical ideal flow path. But the reality, as Toni knew from countless leaky basements, was that flow never conforms to theory when obstructions and easier paths exist. When pressure drops mysteriously in a heating system, Toni's experience told him that the fluid isn't trying to obey the main diagram. It's finding a bypass, a short circuit, a less restricted route that starved the intended destination. He applied this same logic to the R-3350. The cooling air entering the cowling was faced with choice: struggle through the narrow, hot, high-pressure gap between the cylinder rows to cool the rear cylinders, the path of high resistance, or take the easier, wider path over the top of the cylinders and out the cowl flaps, the path of least resistance. The air, predictably, chose the easier path. The flow to the rear cylinders was not merely inadequate, it was practically non-existent, having been choked off by the natural tendency of the fluid to seek equilibrium through the least difficult route. The secret of flow was a missing link. The engineers were fighting against a principle of nature by trying to push more air at the front. Tony realized the solution was not to push harder, but to guide smarter. Instead of trying to force the entire mass of air to behave, he focused on creating a dedicated, lower resistance path specifically for the cooling air required by the rear cylinders. His idea was a plumbing solution. Use small ducts to divert a portion of the incoming cool air around the front row, directly to the rear cylinders. This bypass system would create a guaranteed pressure differential, forcing the flow exactly where it was needed, regardless of the turbulent, high-resistance chaos in the main flow path. It was a brilliantly simple recognition of the power of the secret flow, a concept so fundamentally practical that the theoretically minded engineers had completely overlooked it in their pursuit of complex, high-volume solutions. Tony Valader's intense, solitary examination of the overheated R-3350 engine led him to a definitive conclusion. The cooling air was not just insufficient, it was stagnant, leading directly to the birth of his bypass pipe idea. As Tony traced the path the cooling air was supposed to follow, he realized the front cylinders were doing two things. They were extracting heat from the engine, and, in the process, they were drastically heating the incoming air to temperatures of 300 degrees or more. This hot air then attempted to flow rearward into the intercylinder region. The critical realization was that there was no proper exit path for the superheated, low-velocity air. It became trapped between the cylinder rows, its momentum defeated by the internal obstructions and the pressure of the main airflow bypassing overhead. This trapped, stagnant air was not cooling the rear cylinders at all. It was acting as an efficient insulating blanket, allowing the engine's internal heat to continue climbing unchecked to lethal temperatures. Tony recognized the deadly effectiveness of the stagnation. This specific form of flow failure immediately recalled his experience with the radiators on Euclid Avenue. In that plumbing problem, the third-floor radiator was cold because the hot water, after servicing the lower floors, was stagnating in the supply line, unable to overcome the pressure differential to rise to the highest point. The solution then, as Tony remembered, was simple, mechanical, and non-theoretical. He had installed a small bypass pipe that redirected a portion of the main water flow along a dedicated, lower resistance route directly to the third floor, ensuring sufficient pressure and flow. Standing in the maintenance hangar, staring at a $4 million aircraft engine, Tony realized the problem was identical. The rear cylinders were the third-floor radiators of the B-29. They were the highest point of need, and the main flow was bypassing them. The engineers were trying to install a bigger boiler, more air intake, which wouldn't change the internal pressure dynamics. Tony's bypass pipe idea was to use small aluminum ducts, his version of the copper bypass pipe, to redirect a dedicated stream of unheated cooling air from the main intake around a high-resistance front cylinder bank and directly to the trapped, heat-stressed rear cylinders. This would create a guaranteed low-resistance path, overcoming the stagnation and providing the much-needed mass flow of cool air exactly where the engineers had failed to force it. It was a solution so simple, so rooted in the common sense of fluid mechanics, that it was the only idea that could possibly circumvent the production deadlock and the expert consensus of the aeronautical world. Tony Valader knew, with a certainty born of 15 years as a plumber, that his bypass pipe idea held the key to saving the B-29 program. Yet, he also knew that the same simplicity that made a solution brilliant was precisely why it would be dismissed and ridiculed by the elite aeronautical experts. This was the moment where practical, on-the-job wisdom clashed violently with academic, theoretical engineering. Tony understood the mindset of the man at Wright Aeronautical and NACA. They were professionals who dealt in complex, differential equations, computational fluid dynamics, and stress analysis. Their solutions had to be elegant, scientifically optimized, and derived from first principles. Tony's ideal was none of those things. It was ridiculously simple. It was a mechanical, brute force answer to a theoretical, fluid dynamic problem. The engineers have been focused on optimizing the total cooling airflow and reducing flow restriction. They sought a solution that would allow more air to move naturally through the entire engine block. Tony's proposal, in contrast, was to deliberately restrict the main flow in certain areas and force a dedicated portion of air along a path it wouldn't naturally take. He was suggesting that the fix was not a redesign of the engine's core thermal envelope, but merely the addition of crude aluminum tubing, plumbing, to a $4 million combat aircraft engine. For an engineer who believes they are fighting against the fundamental laws of thermodynamics, suggesting a simple, hand-fabricated pipe will be seen as an insult, a gross oversimplification of a complex, life-or-death problem. Tony could already envision the scene. The highly credentialed men, armed with their slide rules and technical manuals, looking at his rough sketch of a bypass duct and laughing him out of the room. They would immediately point out the turbulent flow paths his ducts would create, the reduction in total cooling air mass flow according to their calculations, and the lack of proper stress analysis. They would dismiss his lack of qualifications, his 7th grade education, and his plumbing background. Tony understood that in the world of high-level engineering, a solution that comes from a maintenance hangar built with scrap parts and tin snips is not merely suspect. It is an affront to the entire profession. It lacked the necessary veneer of complexity and scientific rigor. But Tony's practical experience told him that the correct solution is often the one that directly addresses the reality of flow, regardless of how simple it looks on paper. He knew the engineers were wrong, because their theoretical solution, the complete engine redesign, took 18 months, and his simple idea could be built in a single night. Despite the certainty of ridicule, Tony was prepared to move forward, knowing that the engine temperatures, not the engineers' opinions, would be the final judge. The path to saving the B-29 program required not just a brilliant idea, but an act of profound insubordination. Tony Valliter understood that seeking official engineering approval for his ridiculously simple bypass pipe idea would result only in endless bureaucracy, peer review, and ultimately rejection. He had to bypass the system just as he planned to bypass the engine. Over the course of the next 3 nights, working on the graveyard shift when the airfield and maintenance hangars were quiet, Tony embarked on an act of improvised modification, executed entirely in the shadows. This was his version of the war effort. A mechanic using the guerrilla tactics of a resourceful plumber to solve a crisis that defeated the entire industrial military complex. He could not, of course, requisition parts through official channels, which demanded engineering sign-offs. So, Tony relied on pure resourcefulness and scavenged parts. He found his material in the B-29 salvage yard, a stark testament to the number of bombers that had already burned. He took aluminum tubing from a damaged aircraft awaiting the scrap pile. This was metal that was literally destined for the smelter, which Tony repurposed into the conduits of salvation. His tools were not the specialized instruments of an aeronautical laboratory, but the common instruments of his trade. He borrowed a cutting torch from the welding shop to shape the metal and relied on tin snips and a basic hammer to hand-form the aluminum sheet metal. The work was painstaking and crude, a sharp contrast to the precise, computerized manufacturing of the engine itself. Tony had to carefully modify the existing cylinder baffles, using his tin snips to cut new openings that would serve as the entry and exit points for his bypass ducts. He then fabricated small aluminum ducts, essentially the pipes that were routed along the contours of the engine. These ducts were designed to pull air from the intake, route it cleanly around the high-resistance front cylinder row, and deliver it directly to the rear cylinders, creating the dedicated, low-resistance cooling path he knew was necessary. The completed modification looked exactly like something a plumber cobbled together in a basement, held together with sheet metal screws and high-temperature sealant. It was structurally sound enough to test, but aesthetically and theoretically horrifying to the elite engineers. Tony operated under the principle that the most dangerous thing he could do was not perform an unauthorized modification. The most dangerous thing he could do was nothing at all, allowing B-29s to continue their deadly pattern of self-destruction. His act of working in the shadows was a direct challenge to the authority of the engineering establishment, a gamble that would either lead to a court-martial or the salvation of the entire war program. The completed prototype, the manifestation of Tony Valader's bypass pipe idea, was a physical embodiment of the plumber's engineering, rough, practical, and utterly devoid of the polished precision expected of a combat aircraft component. Tony had successfully integrated his hand-formed aluminum ducts into the right inboard engine of B-29 serial number 42 to 244,605, a training aircraft awaiting a routine engine run-up the next morning. The contrast between the finely machined R-3350 engine and Tony's additions was stark and visually shocking. The ducts were not created via deep draw stamping or automated tooling. They were hand-formed, reflecting the unique contours and tight confines of the engine bay, shaped by a man who has used a bending copper pipe to fit around impossible structural obstacles in old houses. They looked, to the trained eye, like something a plumber would cobble together in a basement, which was exactly their origin. Tony had used sheet metal screws to secure his creation to the existing aluminum structures, relying on a high-temperature sealant to ensure airtight connections. There was no complex stress analysis, no vibration testing, and no computational fluid dynamics involved in their fabrication. There was only Tony's intuitive understanding of flow. His principle was the absolute antithesis of the prevailing engineering doctrine. Instead of seeking to minimize flow restriction, Tony's design was based on forced path cooling. He accepted the high resistance of the main flow path and chose to bypass it entirely, forcing a dedicated portion of cooling air to go where it was desperately needed. The ducts created a low-resistance channel directly to the rear cylinders, ensuring that this critical area would receive a fresh, cool supply of air, overcoming the deadly stagnation. This method violated every textbook rule of aerodynamic cooling design, which prioritized efficiency over targeted delivery. Tony's solution prioritized delivery over efficiency, operating under the simple, practical maxim that an engine that runs cool is better than an engine that runs efficiently for 5 minutes before it seizes and burns. The engine was an elegant theory, but its flaws were practical. Tony's modification was a crude, practical correction that addressed the reality of the thermal problem, not the theory. His hand-formed ducts and sheet metal screws represented a revolutionary challenge to the entire structure of American aviation engineering, proving that sometimes the most complex problems are solved not by advanced degrees, but by the common sense gained from years of dealing with real-world fluid flow in the trenches of civilian life. The success or failure of his plumber's engineering now rested on the outcome of the next morning's test run. On the morning of October 3, 1944, the fate of Tony Valader's career and, unknowingly, the entire B-29 program rested on a seemingly routine flight line event, an engine test run. Tony had finished the installation of his hand-formed bypass ducts in the deep quiet of the night and simply signed off on a maintenance log with a cryptic entry: cooling system inspection complete. Engine cleared for tests. He told no one of his unauthorized modifications. Captain James Wheeler was the pilot assigned to perform the standard engine run-up on B-29 serial number 42 to 244,605. The procedure was standard: advance the throttle, run the engine through its full power settings, monitor pressures and temperatures, and check for any anomalies. Wheeler advanced the throttle and the massive R-3350 engine roared to life, spooling up to its full combat output of 2,200 horsepower at 2,800 RPM. The noise was deafening, the airframe vibrating under the immense power. As per routine, Wheeler focused his attention on the bank of engine instruments. The crucial instrument was the rear cylinder temperature gauge. On every other B-29, this gauge was a source of dread. During a full power run-up, the needle would inexorably climb toward the 550-degree mark within 90 seconds, a terrifying race against the seizure point. But as the engine on number 3 settled into its full power setting, Captain Wheeler watched a reading that was utterly impossible. The rear cylinder temperature gauge did not climb toward the danger zone. It held steadily at 425 degrees Fahrenheit. The front cylinders, which were supposed to be cooler, were registering 410 degrees. The rear cylinders were barely 15 degrees warmer than the fronts, a differential that was nearly negligible compared to the usual 150-degree gap. Wheeler was stunned. He immediately thought the gauge was broken. Such a temperature reading was contrary to everything he knew about the R-3350. It simply did not happen. He held the engine at full power for 5 minutes, far longer than what was normally considered safe for a standard B-29 run-up, consciously pushing the engine to see if the needle would spike. It did not. The rear cylinder temperature gauge barely moved, resting stubbornly at 430 degrees. The rear cylinders were, impossibly, running cooler than they should have been at cruise power, let alone at a full power ground run. Wheeler immediately shut down the engine, convinced the instrument was faulty. He reported to the engineering officer, "Something's wrong with number 3. Temperature readings are impossible. Gauge must be faulty." The crew, upon opening the cowling to inspect the faulty system, would discover Tony's handiwork, setting the stage for the inevitable confrontation. Captain Wheeler's report of the impossible temperature gauge immediately triggered an inspection crew, who were dispatched to investigate the supposedly faulty instrumentation. They quickly discovered the real fault: Tony Valiter's hand-formed aluminum ducts. When the engineering officer saw the crudely fabricated tubing, held together with sheet metal screws and sealant, installed on a combat-critical engine, without any official stamp of approval, he instantly went ballistic. This was not a faulty gauge. This was an unauthorized modification to a highly classified military aircraft, a flagrant violation of protocol and safety regulations. The immediate reaction was one of fury, not curiosity. Who authorized this? Who performed an unauthorized modification to a combat aircraft engine? This was seen as an act of cowboy engineering that was a direct court-martial offense, an action that could lead to criminal charges and immediate end of Tony's war service. Tony was pulled from the flight line and brought before Major Donald Peterson, the Chief of Aircraft Maintenance at Pratt Army Airfield. The confrontation was tense and definitive. Major Peterson, staring at the 7th grade educated plumber who dared to interfere with the work of the nation's top engineers, laid out the charges. "Did you modify that engine without authorization?" "Yes, sir." "Do you understand you could face criminal charges? Unauthorized modifications to military aircraft." Tony, calm and unwavering, stood his ground, letting the raw data speak for him. "Sir, the rear cylinders ran 60 degrees cooler. I have a solution to the overheating problem." Peterson's reaction was one of incredulity and condescension, reflecting the absolute belief in the established expert consensus. "You have a solution, son?" NACA has 50 engineers working on this problem. Wright Aeronautical has their entire design team working on it. Tony's reply was the ultimate articulation of his unorthodox worldview, a defiant declaration of the plumber's wisdom against the engineer's dogma. "With respect, sir, they're all overthinking it. It's a plumbing problem. The air needs a dedicated flow path. I gave it one." Peterson stared at him, unable to reconcile the simplicity of the man's explanation with the impossibility of the temperature logs. "You're a mechanic. You don't have the qualifications to—" Tony cut him off. "I'm a plumber, sir. And in plumbing, when fluid won't flow where you need it, you add a bypass. That's all I did." The major, though still furious at the breach of protocol and the court-martial threat, could not dismiss the cold, hard, recorded data. 60 degrees cooler, sustained full power operation with no temperature rise. It was a result that defied engineering logic and demanded immediate, high-level attention. The immediate aftermath of the confrontation saw a furious Major Donald Peterson grappling with an undeniable, yet logically impossible truth. The data speaks. Tony Valiter, the plumber, had achieved a result that had eluded the combined efforts of the Wright Aeronautical, Boeing and NACA engineers for nearly 2 years. Peterson looked again at the temperature logs from Captain Wheeler's test run. The rear cylinder temperature, the key indicator of the lethal thermal buildup, was not spiking toward the seizure threshold of 600 degrees. It was holding steady at 430 degrees Fahrenheit, a full 60 degrees cooler than the baseline average recorded during previous routine runs. Furthermore, this was achieved on a sustained full power operation, the very conditions that were guaranteed to induce engine fire in the unmodified B-29. This was not a marginal improvement of 5 or 10 degrees, the kind that the engineers had managed with their complex oil cooler designs. This was a massive, statistically significant, and life-saving thermal reduction that promised to move the rear cylinders out of the lethal zone entirely. Peterson's engineering mind screamed impossible. His training told him that Tony's hand-fabricated, non-analyzed ducts should have increased drag and turbulence, leading to worse cooling performance, according to all established aerodynamic principles. He strongly suspected a measurement error, perhaps improperly positioned thermocouples following the unauthorized modification. But Tony, anticipating this very skepticism, had calmly pulled out a second set of logs, stating that he had run 2 additional tests using different thermocouples and monitoring equipment. The results were consistent. The rear cylinders were consistently 50 to 65 degrees cooler than baseline. The data was unequivocal. Peterson, faced with the potential of a major criminal investigation against one of his mechanics, but also holding the key to potentially saving the entire B-29 program, had to make a critical decision. He could not, as a military officer, ignore such a profound reduction in thermal stress. The risk of being wrong about a simple plumber was too great when the alternative was the complete collapse of the strategic bombing campaign. The undeniable truth of the 60 degrees cooler, sustained power data forced his hand. He made the immediate, career-risking decision to bypass the local chain of command and send the starting results directly to Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio, recommending immediate, high-level technical evaluation of the seemingly absurd modification. The war's most intractable engineering problem had just been solved by a simple truth observed on a cheap temperature gauge. The urgency of the B-29 crisis, combined with the irrefutable evidence provided by Tony Valader's test data, propelled the story of the plumber's fix from the remote confines of Pratt Army Airfield into the epicenter of American aviation research, Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio. Major Peterson's official report was terse but definitive. Mechanic modified R-3350 cooling system. Achieved 60-degree temperature reduction. Recommend immediate evaluation. 2 days after his tense confrontation, Tony Valader, the former residential plumber, found himself being transported on AC-47 cargo plane to Dayton. His luggage was not a suitcase, but canvas bag containing the evidence of his crime and his genius. His hand-built aluminum ducts. He was carrying the crude prototypes, the very pieces of scrap metal and sealant that had achieved the impossible, treating them with the casual deference of a plumber bringing his tools to a new job site. The journey symbolized a radical shift in the power dynamic. The academic theory of the entire B-29 program was now being summoned to justify itself against the brute force reality of a maintenance hangar fix. At Wright Field, Tony was ushered into a conference room, a sterile, high-ceiling environment utterly alien to the damp basements and cluttered hangars of his experience. He was met by a panel of a dozen of the nation's most senior engineers, representatives from Wright Aeronautical, Boeing, NACA, and the Army Air Forces. These men represented the collective knowledge and institutional wisdom that had been completely defeated by the R-3350. They had heard about the plumber's modification, and their collective mood was one of intense skepticism and barely concealed condescension. They viewed Tony as a low-level anomaly, a disruption of their highly scientific process, not as a genuine contributor. They were prepared to dismantle his idea with academic precision and send him back to Kansas for his inevitable court-martial. Adding to the gravity of the meeting was the presence of Colonel Curtis E. LeMay, the legendary, no-nonsense commander of the B-29 program in the Pacific Theater. who was visiting right field. LeMay did not care about engineering elegance. He only cared about engines that did not catch fire. His unexpected presence raised the stakes exponentially, transforming the meeting from a technical review into a high-stakes strategic showdown where Tony's aluminum tubes, the scrap metal traveling from Pratt Army Airfield to Wright Field, were about to be placed under the most intensive scrutiny in the history of military aviation. The conference room at Wright Field quickly transformed into a tribunal, with Tony Valliter, the plumber, standing as the unlikely defendant against the collective intellectual weight of American aviation engineering. The formal, hostile proceedings began with Dr. Harrison Evans, the chief aeronautical engineer from Wright Aeronautical. Dr. Evans immediately articulated the engineering establishment's contempt for Tony's unconventional approach. He conceded that the temperature data was interesting, but launched a technical assault on the core premise of the modification. Sergeant Valliter, we have significant concerns about your approach. For starters, you created turbulent flow paths that violate fundamental principles of aerodynamic cooling design. The ducts you installed actually reduced total cooling airflow by approximately 8% according to our calculations. This was the crux of the academic argument. Tony had solved one problem, rear cylinder heat, by creating another, reducing total airflow efficiency. Tony's simple defense was rooted in the irrefutable data. But the rear cylinders run cooler. Dr. Evans dismissed this as a measurement error, and a Boeing engineer quickly jumped in, arguing that the hand-fabricated ducts were utterly impractical for mass production, lacking any stress analysis or long-term durability assessment. The room erupted in a chaotic chorus of disapproval. You don't understand complexity. We can't let mechanics start modifying engines based on hunches. The engineers were not debating the data. They were defending their orthodoxy, their process, and their professional dignity. It was at this critical moment that Colonel Curtis E. LeMay rose from his chair, silencing the room instantly. LeMay was legendary for his utter intolerance for bureaucracy and any technical argument that superseded operational reality. His presence was a strategic shockwave. He focused his cold, intense gaze on Tony. Sergeant, I have B-29s burning up on Saipan. I have crews refusing to fly because they're more afraid of their own engines than they are of Japanese fighters. Now you're telling me you can fix this problem with some aluminum tubes. Tony replied simply, yes, sir. LeMay turned on Dr. Evans. How long has Wright Aeronautical been working on this cooling problem? Since early 1943, Colonel. Approximately 20 months. LeMay's voice hardened. 20 months. And what solutions have you implemented? Dr. Evans stammered, admitting only to incremental improvements that had failed to deliver the required operational safety. LeMay slammed the temperature logs on the conference table. Sergeant Valliter achieved a 60-degree temperature reduction with aluminum tubes he made in a maintenance hangar in one night using scrap parts. And you gentlemen are telling me it can't work because it's not properly engineered. The room remained silent under the sheer weight of his authoritative presence. The tribunal had reached its verdict, delivered not by the engineers, but by the commander whose immediate priority was survival and victory. Colonel Curtis E. LeMay's powerful, cutting intervention immediately ended the technical debate and issued a radical mandate that shattered the production deadlock and the established timeline of the entire B-29 program. He had no patience for the engineers' self-justifying bureaucracy and their 20-month failure. His focus was singular. The B-29 had to fly safely, and it had to fly now. LeMay delivered his non-negotiable directive, transforming Tony's rough prototypes into the highest priority of American military engineering. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to take Sergeant Valliter's modification. You're going to engineer it properly. Stress analysis, vibration testing, whatever you need to do, and you're going to get into production. He then delivered the shock that transformed the engineers' despair into a frenzy of forced action. Not in 20 months, not in 20 weeks, in 20 days. The engineers, led by the stunned Dr. Evans, immediately protested. Colonel, that's impossible. LeMay was unflinching, the intensity in his eyes conveying the absolute strategic urgency. "Then you better work fast, because in 30 days, I'm bombing Japan with 500 B-29s, and I need engines that don't burn up over the Pacific. Sergeant Valiter has shown you how to fix it. Now, do your job and implement it." This was a definitive strategic reset. The engineers were stripped of their intellectual arrogance and forced into a role of technical servitude to the plumber's practical solution. Their job was no longer to find a theoretical solution, but to retroactively apply the required engineering rigor, the stress analysis, the durability assessment to Tony's existing design, ensuring it could withstand the rigors of combat. LeMay's mandate completely inverted the traditional process. The solution was provided first, and the theoretical justification was forced to follow. He had successfully used the desperation of the war effort to bypass the paralyzing complexity of the established technical protocol. He then turned to Tony, acknowledging his crucial role, while issuing a final, prescient warning. "Sergeant, you'll remain at right field as a technical consultant. These gentlemen are going to have questions about your modification. You'll answer them. And Sergeant, don't let these engineers overcomplicate this. Sometimes the best solution is the simple one." Tony Valiter, the plumber, had just been elevated from a court-martial candidate to a technical consultant, now overseeing the work of the nation's top aeronautical experts under a high-pressure 20-day mandate. Under the immense and non-negotiable pressure of Colonel LeMay's 20-day mandate, the engineering teams at Wright Field immediately mobilized into a state of forced, hyper-intensive action. Their new, humbling task was to reverse engineer the plumber's fix. The engineers, including Dr. Harrison Evans from Wright Aeronautical, were forced to set aside their theoretical objections and treat Tony Valiter's crude, hand-formed aluminum ducts not as an unauthorized modification, but as a fully validated working prototype, a black box solution that they now had to understand and formalize. The testing was brutal and comprehensive, a frantic attempt to apply 2 years of theoretical research to justify 24 hours of a plumber's practical instinct. They took Tony's prototype and began the process of creating proper, precise technical drawings, a necessary step for mass production. They ran detailed computational fluid dynamics analyses, albeit primitive by modern standards, to try and map the actual airflow patterns that Tony's bypass ducts created. They were searching for the exact physical principle that allowed the ducts to achieve a 60-degree temperature reduction despite reducing the overall air mass flow. They installed an array of highly calibrated thermocouples, up to 36 measurement points throughout the engine, to meticulously monitor every temperature, pressure, and vibration frequency. The testing protocol was designed to be deliberately destructive, running the engine at full power for 2 consecutive hours, twice as long as any B-29 would ever maintain maximum power in actual combat operations. The sheer intensity of the testing confirmed the impossible truth. The baseline R 3350, without the modification, saw rear cylinder temperatures averaging 565 degrees, peaking well over 600 degrees, leading to certain exhaust valve failure in just over an hour. The modified R 3350 with Valiter's ducts showed a stunning, consistent result. Rear cylinder temperatures averaged a safe 445 degrees, with a peak temperature of 478 degrees. Crucially, the lethal temperature differential between the front and rear cylinders, which was previously 155 degrees, was reduced to a mere 30 degrees. Dr. Evans, the chief aeronautical engineer, was forced to run the numbers 3 times, absolutely convinced there must be an error. There was none. The team realized that Tony's seemingly crude bypass pipe was not optimizing flow quantity, but optimizing flow quality and delivery, forcing a critical mass of cool, unheated air directly to the stagnant rear cylinders, proving that the simple solution was indeed the best solution. The engineers were forced to admit that the plumber's intuition about where the air needed to go was far more accurate than their complex theoretical models. The exhaustive, Force testing conducted by the engineers at Wright Field yielded a finding so radical it overturned decades of aerodynamic cooling theory. The 120-degree miracle. The data showed that the modified R3350 engine, equipped with Tony Valader's simple bypass ducts, reduced the average rear cylinder temperature by a full 120 degrees Fahrenheit compared to the baseline readings taken just weeks earlier. This was not a marginal gain. It was a fundamental, life-saving transformation of the engine's thermodynamics. Dr. Evans, the lead aeronautical engineer from Wright Aeronautical, struggled to reconcile this practical reality with his theoretical knowledge. He confronted Tony, trying to understand the scientific justification for what he had witnessed. The ducts actually reduced total cooling airflow by 8%. You're moving less air, but achieving better cooling. How is this possible? The engineers were fixated on flow quantity, the total mass of air moving to the cowling, a metric that Tony's crude ducts had marginally reduced. Tony's response, rooted in the practicality of plumbing, was a simple key that unlocked the crisis. It's not about how much air. It's about getting the air where it's needed. Those rear cylinders weren't getting any airflow at all. The air was taking an easier path over the top of the cowling. The ducts force the air to go where it doesn't want to go naturally. This was the core of the 120-degree miracle. Flow quality over quantity. The conventional engineers had failed because they were treating the air as a homogeneous mass that needed to be pushed harder. Tony, the plumber, treated the air as a fluid that needed to be guided and directed. He realized that the tiny portion of air he successfully diverted, even though it reduced the overall efficiency by 8%, was the only cool airstream actually reaching the stagnant, superheated rear cylinders. By creating a dedicated, low-resistance path, the bypass pipe generated a guaranteed pressure differential, overcoming the thermal inertia and resistance that had defeated the entire original engine design. Tony's simple maxim: in plumbing, sometimes you need to restrict flow in one place to create pressure in another, was revealed as a fundamental principle of engine cooling, a principle that had been completely overlooked by the nation's top experts. The ducts were not an aerodynamic component. They were a fluid management system, and in managing the flow, Tony had achieved the impossible, transforming the B-29 from a flying funeral pyre into a reliable weapon of war. The theoretical objections vanished in the face of the data, and the focus shifted entirely to the rapid industrialization of Tony's simple, powerful idea. The relentless, non-stop testing mandated by Colonel LeMay concluded triumphantly on October 28, 1944. The evidence was irrefutable, and the thermal results guaranteed the operational future of the B-29. Immediately, LeMay approved emergency implementation. Tony Valader's crude hand-formed fix was instantly legalized, formalized, and stamped with the official approval of the Army Air Forces. The name given to this life-saving innovation in the formal technical manuals was the Valader Bypass Cooling System. This was the official recognition of the plumber's contribution, a rare instance where a low-ranking mechanic was credited by name for a fundamental design change that impacted the war effort at the highest strategic level. Boeing received the final technical drawings of the newly engineered ducts on October 30th. The production deadlines were insane, but the imperative was clear. The Valader bypass cooling system had to be integrated immediately. Within an astonishing 15 days, by November 15th, Boeing had successfully retooled its massive production line. This incredible feat of industrial mobilization was a testament to the immense power of LeMay's mandate and the sheer desperation of the situation. Every new R3350 engine rolling off the assembly line at Wright Aeronautical was immediately required to incorporate the new cooling feature. On the airfields and in the maintenance hangars, the modification quickly acquired a more personal and enduring nickname. The crews, who understood and respected the man who gave them a plane that wouldn't kill them, simply called them Tony Ducks. This was a badge of honor, a grassroots designation that cut through the official nomenclature, a simple, affectionate term for the aluminum tubes that had restored their confidence in the magnificent but deeply flawed Superfortress. The transformation was complete. The scrap aluminum scavenged from a damaged bomber had moved from an unauthorized improvised modification to an essential military specification, a critical component of every B-29 airframe. The ability of the American industrial engine to pivot so swiftly, to move from an 18-month, $50 million redesign to a 15-day implementation of a simple bypass pipe, was a direct result of Tony's practicality and LeMay's ruthlessness. The Validar bypass cooling system was now a reality, transforming the engine's internal environment from a volatile, self-destructive thermal trap into a stable, operational machine. The stage was now set for the ultimate proof, the first long-range combat missions over the Pacific. The true, ultimate validation of the Validar bypass cooling system arrived on November 24, 1944, when the first B-29s equipped with Tony's modification landed in the Pacific Theater, specifically at Saipan and the Mariana Islands. They were assigned to the 73rd Bombardment Wing under the direct, watchful command of General Curtis LeMay. The first aircraft chosen for the ultimate combat test was the B-29 City of Los Angeles, piloted by Captain Robert Fitzgerald. The mission, a massive bombing strike against the Musashino aircraft plant near Tokyo. The target, distance, and mission profile were designed to stress the B-29's engines to the absolute breaking point. The round trip covered over 3,000 miles, requiring the engines to maintain high power settings for approximately 9 uninterrupted hours. This profile, a long overwater flight, a high-altitude climb to 32,000 feet, and sustained cruise power for hours, was a perfect scenario for engine overheating that had previously guaranteed engine failure. Monitoring the engines with obsessive intensity was Technical Sergeant Mike Romano, the flight engineer. Romano was a man with 3 engine fires in his logbook, a survivor who knew the warning signs intimately. The rear cylinder gauge spiking above 550 degrees, the frantic oil pressure fluctuations, the exhaust gas temperature climbing past its limit. For hours, Romano's eyes were glued to the engine instruments, specifically watching the indicator for the number 3 engine, the right inboard, which had historically been the most volatile and fire-prone position on the Superfortress. The flight progressed for 2 agonizing hours, pushing the B-29 to the thermal danger zone. Yet, the rear cylinder gauge on number 3 engine was doing something miraculous. It read a stable 438 degrees Fahrenheit. The front cylinders, in comparison, showed 421 degrees. The temperature differential was nearly negligible, a complete reversal of the engine's deadly history. Romano was paralyzed by the reading. He checked the gauge again, tapped it, and checked the circuit breaker, convinced the instrument was malfunctioning. "Captain, I think we got a faulty temp gauge on number 3. What's it reading?" "Rear cylinders showing 438, Romano reported. "That's impossible," Fitzgerald muttered, glancing at his own instruments, which confirmed the stunning stability. The 2 men, hardened combat flyers, could not comprehend an R-3350 that ran cool and stable under full power. They continued the mission, a grueling 9-hour flight that was the longest Fitzgerald had ever kept a B-29 at sustained high power. The engine never exceeded 455 degrees on the rear cylinders. When they finally landed safely back at Saipan, Romano immediately inspected the number 3 engine. There were no signs of heat stress, no discoloration, and no warp cooling fins. The simple hand-fabricated Tony ducts had achieved operational success where 2 years of elite engineering had failed. The bomber, once a death trap, was now reliable, transforming the tactical capability of the entire B-29 fleet overnight. The success of the city of Los Angeles was quickly replicated across the entire 73rd Bombardment Wing. Over the next 3 months, from December 1944 to February 1945, the operational data poured in, creating a definitive record of strategic triumph. The numbers were staggering, a complete and total reversal of the catastrophic statistics that had previously defined the B-29 program. The key metric was the engine fire rate per 100 flight hours. In the pre-modification period, September-October 1944, the rate was a crippling 4.2 engine fires per 100 hours, leading to a mission abort rate of 31% and an 18% early engine replacement rate due to thermal damage. Post-modification, with a Validar bypass cooling system fully implemented, the rate collapsed to an almost negligible 0.7 engine fires per 100 flight hours. This represented an astonishing reduction in engine fires by 83%. The mission abort rate, once 31%, dropped to just 6%, and early engine replacements due to thermal damage plummeted to 3%. The implications of this strategic triumph were immediate and profound. Before Tony's modification, the 20th Air Force was losing approximately 22 B-29s every single month to engine fires and related mechanical failures. After the modification, that loss rate dropped to only 4 per month. Conservative estimates credit Tony Valadar's simple cooling ducts with saving at least 216 B-29s over the final 12 months of the war. With 11 crew members per aircraft, this translates to an estimated 2,376 American lives saved. Lives saved not from enemy action, but from the fatal flaws of their own equipment. The broader strategic impact was incalculable. With reliable engines, the B-29 could finally maintain the sustained high-altitude, long-range bombing campaign against the Japanese home islands without interruption. The firebombing of Tokyo, the destruction of Japanese war industries, and ultimately the atomic bomb missions to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. None of these decisive operations could have been executed without the B-29s maintaining the ability to fly 3,000-mile missions without their engines catching fire. The fate of the Pacific War was quite literally saved by the simple, practical genius of a plumber's intuition, translating directly into a decisive strategic triumph. The operational silence that fell over B-29 fleet in late 1944, the sudden, dramatic cessation of engine failures, did not go unnoticed by the Imperial Japanese military. In the years following the war, captured Japanese Army Air Force documents revealed their profound and devastating reaction, a stark confirmation of the strategic triumph achieved by the Validar bypass cooling system. The Japanese assessment was unambiguous. We lost the air war the moment the B-29 became reliable. Lieutenant General Torosiro Kaob, Deputy Chief of the Imperial Japanese Army General Staff, recorded in his personal diary his observation of the crisis and its sudden, inexplicable resolution. Kaob noted that in the autumn of 1944, the Japanese High Command genuinely believed that the B-29 program was failing. Their intelligence reports, based on observations of bombers sputtering, losing engines, and falling out of formation over Japanese territory, indicated high mechanical loss rates. They calculated that the Americans could not possibly sustain operations against the vast distances of the Pacific. This brief period of internal failure provided a crucial window of strategic relief for the Imperial forces, allowing them to hope that the American technological advantage would be negated by the Superfortress's fatal unreliability. However, Kaob's diary recorded a moment of definitive change. Then in December 1944, everything changed. The B-29 suddenly appeared in greater numbers, flying longer missions, and critically, their engines no longer failed over our territory. The mechanical vulnerability, which the Japanese had come to rely upon as a key factor in their defense strategy, vanished entirely. They realized with devastating clarity that they had lost a strategic air war. A prominent Japanese fighter pilot, Captain Saburo Sakai, later recalled his terrifying observations. "We feared the B-29 not because of its weapons, but because of its reliability. Earlier in 1944, we would sometimes see them lose engines, fall behind formations, become vulnerable. After late 1944, they flew in perfect formation for hours. Their engines never stopped. We knew we could not win against such machines." This was the ultimate, enemy-confirmed testament to Tony Valadar's simple modification. It wasn't the bomb load or the altitude that broke the Japanese will. It was the sheer, terrifying, relentless reliability that Tony's bypass ducts delivered. The Japanese had strategically factored in the B-29 self-destructive tendencies, and when a plumber in Kansas erased that vulnerability, the entire balance of power in the Pacific tipped irrevocably toward the Allies. By June 1945, the war in Europe had concluded, and the war in the Pacific was entering its final, brutal stage. Tony Valiter, the man who saved the B-29 program, was being processed for discharge at Wright Field, ready to return to civilian life and his plumbing business in Cleveland. Before his departure, the Army Air Forces attempted to formally recognize his monumental contribution. They sought to award him the Army Commendation Medal for technical innovation that significantly contributed to the war effort. For the brass, this was a small, formal gesture of thanks for saving hundreds of aircraft and thousands of lives. Tony's reaction was typical of the man who operated outside of the military-industrial complex's obsession with prestige and formality. He refused the medal. A colonel, attempting to pin the medal onto his uniform, was met with Tony's unwavering simplicity. "I didn't do anything special," Tony told the stunned officer. "I just fixed the cooling problem. That's what mechanics do." The refusal was not an act of false modesty or rebellion. It was a pure reflection of his core conviction that he was merely doing his job, applying the practical wisdom of his trade to a problem that the academics had overcomplicated. The colonel was completely astonished by his perspective. "Sergeant, your modification saved over 200 aircraft and thousands of lives." Tony's response was firm. "Then give the medal to the crews who flew the missions. They're the heroes. I just installed some aluminum pipes." Tony could not accept the status of a hero because he did not see his action as an extraordinary feat of engineering genius. He saw it as an ordinary feat of troubleshooting. The engineers figured out how to build the engine. The pilots figured out how to fly it. Tony figured out how to keep it cool. He viewed their roles as equally important components of a larger, functional system. The colonel was forced to accept his decision, but the exchange offered the final, definitive insight into Tony Valiter's character. He had no desire for fame or the accolades of the military establishment. He wanted to return to Cleveland, to his pipes, his tools, and his simple, practical life. He would return home having saved 2,376 American lives, a triumph he would never mention to a client, viewing the entire world-altering episode as nothing more than a challenging service call. "I just fixed a cooling problem. That's all." Tony Valiter returned to Cleveland, Ohio, the city of his birth, and immediately went back to work in the trade he knew and loved. He reopened his father's small plumbing business, quietly resuming his life of installing sinks, fixing toilets, and running water lines to the complicated architecture of old residential homes. True to his refusal of the Army Commendation Medal, Tony never mentioned his war work to his clients or his neighbors. To them, he was simply Tony Valiter, a highly skilled, reliable local plumber who could fix a problem water system that stumped everyone else. His immense contribution to the strategic outcome of World War II remained a complete secret within his local community. However, in 1947, a reporter from the Cleveland Plain Dealer newspaper, digging into local war records and following a faint trail from Wright Field, eventually stumbled upon the incredible story of the plumber who saved the B-29 program. The reporter was eager to write a major feature article, finally giving Tony the public recognition he had so clearly earned. Tony, however, declined the interview. He maintained his quiet dignity and firm resistance to the spotlight. "I don't want publicity," he told the persistent reporter. "I did my job. That's all there is to it." The reporter wrote the article anyway, compelled by the sheer novelty and power of the story, but without Tony's direct cooperation. The headline was telling: "Cleveland plumber's simple idea solved B-29 crisis." The article, highlighting the bizarre contrast between the complexity of aeronautical science and simplicity of a plumber's fix, ran on page 7. Buried beneath headlines of immediate post-war adjustment, few people noticed the technical significance, and Tony's name quickly faded from the national consciousness, exactly as he intended. His legacy, however, was quietly being written in the design rooms of the nation's major engine manufacturers. Tony Valader's bypass cooling concept did not disappear. It became standard practice in aircraft engine design. Modern, powerful turbojet and turbofan engines, including those powering today's advanced combat and commercial aircraft, utilize sophisticated descendants of Tony's simple idea. Aviation engineers now refer to technique as directed cooling or forced path cooling. The principle remains identical to Tony's realization: when fluid won't flow naturally where you need it, build a better, dedicated path. Tony Valader may have faded into obscurity, but his plumbing legacy became a fundamental, uncredited cornerstone of modern engine thermal management. The immediate strategic triumph of the B-29 was merely the beginning of Tony Valader's enduring technical legacy. While history forgot the plumber's name, his simple principle, forced path, or directed cooling, became a fundamental and non-negotiable component of advanced engine design across the entire aviation and aerospace sector. Engineers understood finally that relying on natural circulation and simple ram air to cool highly stressed, compact engines was fundamentally unreliable. The lesson of the R-3350 was absorbed. Flow must be guided. Today, the principles Tony implemented with scavenged aluminum and tin snips are executed with hyper-precise manufacturing and computational fluid dynamics. The Pratt & Whitney F-135 engine that powers the F-35 Lightning II stealth fighter jet uses advanced internal bypass cooling systems to manage the immense heat generated by its core components. The massive General Electric G9X, the world's most powerful jet engine used on the Boeing 777X, incorporates these directed cooling principles deep within its thermal management architecture to ensure stability and efficiency. The legacy extends far beyond atmospheric flight. Even NASA's thermal management systems for spacecraft and the International Space Station employ similar bypass cooling principles. The complex fluid loops that prevent the station from overheating in the vacuum of space use a form of directed flow cooling that Tony Valader, the plumber, would immediately recognize as his own simple logic applied on an interplanetary scale. The principle is universal. In any system where a fluid medium, air, oil, or coolant must manage immense heat in a restricted space, the creation of a dedicated, low-resistance path is essential to prevent stagnation and thermal failure. Tony Valader, who died in 1982 at age 76, spent the remainder of his life working as a plumber. His obituary in the Cleveland Plain Dealer mentioned only that he served as an aircraft mechanic during World War II, making no mention of the B-29 program, no mention of the 2,376 lives saved. He remained an unheralded hero, a man whose practical, blue-collar genius became an enduring technical legacy, underpinning the reliability of the most powerful and sophisticated engines ever created, proving that the most complex problems often yield to the simplest, most intuitive truths. Tony Valader's funeral in 1982 was a quiet, modest affair, reflecting the humble life he chose to lead. But among the mourners, a single figure stood quietly in the back, a man in his 60s whom nobody in Tony's family or neighborhood recognized. This man waited patiently until the service concluded, then approached Tony's son. His approach was a moment of profound, delayed acknowledgement, a final, poignant recognition of the plumber's forgotten heroism. "I flew B-29s in the Pacific," the man revealed to Tony's confused son. 35 missions. My crew came home because our engines didn't catch fire." The veteran explained that he had spent the last 40 years quietly trying to track down the mechanic who invented those life-saving cooling ducts, the legendary Tony ducts. "I didn't know your father personally," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I've spent 40 years trying to find a mechanic who invented those cooling ducts. I wanted to thank him." Tony's son was understandably baffled. "My father never said anything about inventing anything. He always said he was just a plumber." The veteran smiled sadly, a final, knowing testament to Tony Valader's selfless character. "That sounds like the kind of man who'd save 2,000 lives and never think it was a big deal." This final, powerful exchange encapsulated Tony Valader's entire life, and the ultimate truth of his contribution. He was not motivated by glory, credit, or the advanced theories of aerodynamics. He was motivated by the simple, practical imperative of his trade: fixing a broken system. His genius lay not in adding complexity, but in realizing that the engine's problem was, at its core, a simple plumbing problem. The most complex, strategic war-winning technology of the era was saved by the application of wisdom learned from wrestling with copper pipes in dark, unforgiving basements. Tony Valliter wasn't a genius, and he never claimed to be a hero. He was a plumber who understood the essential secret of flow, a man whose quiet, hands-on knowledge transcended the limitations of academic expertise, and, in doing so, changed the course of World War II. The statistical reality of the B-29 program, once a source of terror and strategic paralysis, now stands as a definitive, quantitative proof of Tony Valliter's monumental impact. The production numbers tell the story of a program transformed from self-destruction to strategic dominance. The official total count reveals that 3,970 B-29 Superfortresses were built. Of that total, 147 B-29s were lost to enemy action throughout the war, a testament to the high-altitude performance that made them largely invulnerable to Japanese fighters. But the original, fatal flaw is highlighted by the 267 B-29s lost to engine fires and mechanical failure before the Valliter bypass cooling system was implemented. The staggering loss rate, nearly twice that of combat losses, confirms the B-29 was its own deadliest enemy. The intervention of the plumber changed everything. Based on the documented drop in engine fire rates, the estimated number of B-29s saved by Valliter's cooling system is 216. This simple modification ensured that over 18,000 R-3350 engines were produced with a new cooling design, making Tony's principle a universal component of the engine. The ultimate, most crucial number is the estimate of 2,376 American crew lives saved. Lives that were spared the terror of being incinerated over a remote Kansas field or the empty expanse of the Pacific. Today, the technical principles of directed cooling born from Tony's simple tubes are essential components in every modern aircraft with air-cooled engines, from the smallest Cessna 172 to the massive Boeing 787. His story is the final summation of a profound truth. The greatest innovations don't always come from the top of the academic pyramid. Sometimes they emerge in the hands of the working man, the one who spent years dealing with the frustrating, practical reality of fluid flow. Tony Valliter was not remembered by history books, but his simple solution is alive in the reliable power of every high-performance engine that flies today, a quiet, enduring testament to the genius of the simple truth. The story of Tony Valliter is not just a footnote in World War II history. It is a profound lesson in the nature of innovation and the sometimes paralyzing effect of expertise. The crisis of the B-29 was a complex problem that yielded not to complex science, but to simple observation. The elite engineers, steeped in theory, saw a problem in thermodynamics and aerodynamics, demanding multi-million-dollar redesigns. The plumber, Tony Valliter, saw a familiar problem of flow resistance and stagnation, a challenge he had solved countless times in a cold basement with a wrench and a pipe. He reminded the world that when science hits a wall of complexity, the simple, practical truth often provides the answer. His refusal to meddle, his return to a quiet life of plumbing and the quiet dignity with which he performed his work all underscore the final, powerful message. That true genius often lies in the ability to see a massive problem and reduce it to its simplest, most manageable form. The Valliter bypass cooling system remains one of the greatest unheralded achievements of the war, a monument not to advanced engineering, but to the timeless, invaluable wisdom of the working man. The Superfortress was saved, thousands of lives were spared, and the course of the Pacific War was decisively altered, all because a plumber from Cleveland looked at the world's most advanced engine and saw nothing more than a stubborn, overheated radiator that needed a little help. If this incredible, untold story of Tony Valliter has moved you, if you believe that the quiet heroes of history deserve to be remembered, then we ask you to take action right now. First, hit that like button to help share Tony's story with a wider audience. Every like tells the algorithm that this history matters. Second, if you're learning something truly new and remarkable today, make sure to subscribe to our channel. We are dedicated to bringing you more powerful, untold stories from the pages of history, stories that often get buried beneath the grand narratives. Finally, share this video with someone, a veteran, a history buff, an engineer, or even a plumber, who appreciates the power of a simple, elegant solution. Let's make sure that Tony Valader, the plumber who saved the B-29 program in 2,000 lives, is finally given the credit he so stoically refused in life. Your support ensures that the genius of the simple man is never forgotten.